Hello, my name is Gene Monterastelli, and I am the editor of Tapping QandA.com. And the video that you are about to watch is an interview that I did as part of the 24 Hours of Tapping. The 24 Hours of Tapping was a free event, which was a fundraiser for the Peaceful Heart Network. The Peaceful Heart Network provides training and trauma relief tools to those in war-torn countries, as well as working with refugees all over the world. They've been able to help out over 200,000 people all over the world. After you watch this video, if you find this video something that was useful, the very easy way that you can say thank you to the guest for giving their time and sharing their expertise is to go to 24hoursoftapping.com/support and make a small contribution to support the Peaceful Heart Network. Again, that is 24hoursoftapping.com/support, and I hope you enjoy this conversation. Up next is Dr. Craig Weiner. Craig is the director of the EFT Tapping Training Institute, and a continuing education program on tapping out of trauma. And that's actually one of the things that they offered as part of the raffle, is the opportunity to participate in that. He's a master trainer of trainers for EFT International, a certified trainer in matrix reimprinting, and a meta health trainer and practitioner. His passion is to educate and influence practitioners and individuals as to the power of understanding how trauma influences every aspect of the person's life, how to safely and gently work with the traumatic experience, and how to provide opportunities for growth and resilience in achieving a post-traumatic growth. And that is exactly what this conversation is about. This is an opportunity for us to have a conversation on trauma-informed tapping. And this isn't just about how we approach our clients, but this is the way that we show up as well. And so I hope you enjoy my interview with Craig. So the first thing that I always like to do is I always like to define terms so that when someone is saying something, I know exactly what they mean, not what I think they mean. And kind of one of the phrases du jour in transformation right now is this idea of trauma informed. And so when you're using the term trauma informed, what do you mean by that particular term? And then we can kind of talk into how we use that and approach things from that point of view.
Yeah, so that's a good question, because there is no one definition for trauma informed.
Okay.
Right? In other words, there's not like this one place that you can look and that's the correct definition of trauma informed. So it certainly has been a term du jour, as I like that. And so for me, it's one of those terms that informs me in a way that I keep learning what that means for me. And as a term, because we can look at trauma-informed practices. We can look at trauma-informed procedures. We can look at a trauma-informed individual. I mean, so many different things. So different elements that I think are trauma-informed, not like it's white or black. Or I think I even heard Bessel once say, I would never say I was a trauma-informed practitioner. In other words, kind of what does that mean? And it's not official. But what it does say for EFT practitioners, through that lens, are several elements. Number one is that one recognizes the extent to which trauma impacts a person's life. Okay. Which is an ongoing recognition.
Yep.
And on one hand, we say we know that, but then, for example, I remember hearing Dr. Gabor Mate saying, trauma informs who we are and how we live to the extent that it informs what clothes we choose to put on in the morning. And I remember hearing that and saying, okay, that's a little much, don't you think? Except when you start to think about it, right? If we look at the impact of, do I wear bright clothes that attract attention to me? Or do I tend to not? Do I tend to be pulled toward tight clothing or loose baggy clothing? When I start to look at, and we can, look to, people that have been speaking out, and Billie Eilish and so many people just in fashion and other things that say, how much attention I want on me is absolutely impacted by the trauma that I've lived through or not. So who I hang around with, what places I go and don't go, what I think myself capable of as far as a profession or education. So starting to continue to educate the widespread impact of trauma on an individual, on a system, on a school system, on a police system, on a educational system. So one hand, there's the ongoing depth of understanding the extent to which trauma influences. You can't understand a penal system and a legal system as far as punishment and consequences without looking at a trauma-informed perspective that alters how or affects how you see that system. So on one hand, there's just it's the ongoing realization and depth of understanding. On the other hand, there's also, or not on the other hand, in addition, there's the recognition of learning of all the different kinds of signs and symptoms of trauma, right? So, what does that mean? Well, as EFT practitioners, we know personally or with our clients, what a wide array of way a history of trauma can show up in a person. So it may show up as the client that has a hard time expressing emotions and feeling things and is always very cognitive and in their head. Now, not everybody that's very cognitive and not connected to their emotions has been through a lot of trauma, but to not take that into account would really be erroneous. We need to look at the disconnection that one has from often one's emotions, or what about the client that we're asking, where do you feel that in your body? And they say, I don't feel stuff in my body. When we start to look at, red light in my head going, there may be at the root of that a lot of trauma that doesn't make the person feel safe in their body. I'm not going to keep pushing that question, for example. So it could show up in a person's affect. It can show up in the way they feel numb or disconnected, the way they behave as far as withdrawing and staying to themselves and isolating, behaviors of unconscious hypervigilance, always being, and I know that one personally. We start to look at all different types of emotions that might be stemming from trauma, from shame, ongoing anxiety, of course, things like depression, fear, hopelessness, so many different emotions that may be drawn from original trauma. We start to look at behaviors when people start to have addictive type and compulsive type behaviors. History of trauma, very likely. Not always, because there's not research that says this, people that consider themselves highly sensitive, very often a history of trauma. And when we start to look at, the adverse childhood experiences studies, all the childhood studies, we see absolute correlations between that and physical illness, heart disease, liver disease, longevity, suicidality, one's relationship with one's sexuality, so many different connections between early childhood trauma and later, that as we become more educated and informed about that, it affects our lens, and hopefully it also affects our skills and practices about how we work with our clients. So the widespreadness of trauma as an EFT practitioner is just huge for us to continue educating ourselves about. So trauma informed includes that. I'll take a pause because that was a lot and there's more, but
yeah. And so like, as you hear that, there's two forks going off in my brain at the exact same time. So we're going to take these one at a time.
Okay.
So the first fork, so great. We are now in a circumstance where we're thinking about, we recognize this is something that is impacting us. We need to be aware of this sort of stuff. That is lovely as a concept, that is lovely as a disposition. What does that actually mean when I'm sitting down and tapping on my own, when I'm sitting down and tapping with someone else, other than thinking about that particular recognition? Like, how then does that become a useful recognition? And I'm not saying it's not, but like, how do we great, I know there's a possibility. For me, it's all of this stuff is tools, which means that if it is a tool, it has to be useful. How is this useful? I guess is the way to ask the question more succinctly.
Wow, that's kind of the huge body of the rest of the discussion today, isn't it? It's another word. Yeah. I mean, what I hear you saying is, okay, so being trauma informed includes realizing its impact and the things we were talking about. Then we have to start looking at how do we integrate that trauma knowledge into our procedures and practices, how we are with a client, both as a person, as an interactive being, from setting up consults and having emails and conversations and setting up sessions. I mean, all those different things that we interact with people, and then in our practices, in our direct EFT practices. And how do we then take that information, inquire safely about that, and then avoid re-traumatization through EFT as well? I remember hearing somebody once say, you know what? EFT is amazing. And, EFT can't traumatize anybody. It's that gentle. And I'm like, okay, I so do not agree with that. Because if you have two people interacting, one person can be triggered and or re-traumatized. I don't care what technique it is. They could be having a conversation and not even doing tapping and re-traumatize somebody. So it's the interpersonal interaction,
right,
of whether a person is co-regulated with you and facilitated toward safety or not. And that can happen with any process, not just EFT, right? So in other words, so an interaction with one's self isn't necessarily any more safe than with another person, because we're not often our best ally, are we?
Yeah.
So, right. So I just want to just kind of hold that for a second of that what we want to do is we want to take this information, as you say, as a kind of a concept, and then what are practices and what are ways that we integrate into safe practices in working with a client to reduce re-traumatization, to appropriately not manage, but facilitate and support their healing. And yeah, I definitely want to go into different arenas, but just kind of to hold that for a moment. Put a pin in that. Okay, so what are some different elements that I think are most critical in my experience? So I do a lot. I want to back up. I teach a lot about trauma. I still don't consider myself a trauma expert. I think that's a never-ending learning to become more trauma-informed. But I've learned a lot. And I teach practitioners about integrating trauma, EFT practitioners about that. So where it comes from for me was the realization is I had childhood trauma. Okay, could have been a lot worse. Other people had a lot worse. I had my experience of that. And what I realized was that the resilience that came from that and the trauma healing that came from that moved me in a direction of finally understanding how important safety is for healing. And so I realized I devoted my life kind of unconsciously toward educating and teaching and supporting and facilitating safety, right? Because safety is just, read any of the work of Bessel van der Kolk, read Stephen Porges, read anybody involved in the trauma healing world and Peter Levine and on and on and on, but that Rothschild and all the leaders understand that when the body feels safe, the body can start to heal. If the body doesn't feel safe, mind doesn't feel safe, we don't heal. So it's all about safety. And it's okay that it's all about safety. You're not a wuss thinking, oh, I need to feel safe. It's actually a critical component, which is how I used to feel about it. It's like, oh God, you're such a baby. You need to feel safe all the time. Yeah. And it's like, no, now I own that and I understand the importance of it. So what are some key elements, and we can break down and explore them. When one starts to interact with a client and we know that we're working with something traumatic, and we'll clarify how we get there and all those things later. The first thing I want to say is slow it down. Okay. That we have to create safety and rapport. And as my co-teacher and friend, Suzanne Fagel says, with trauma, you can only go as fast as the slowest part of you feels safe going. And so what I found in the EFT world is that often there's this direct experience that somebody has of amazing healing and transformation. And it's like, I'll name and date myself. Back in the old Werner Erhard and S days, people would come out with this enthusiasm and excitement and want to share it with everybody. And they'd almost be like this kind of avalanche of excitement and wanting to do and help everybody. And in their own excitement, they don't see as clearly that not everybody is in the same readiness or place to be able to handle that level of intensity. So we need to learn how to titrate our work, to go slowly, to keep a person in what we call an optimal arousal zone, feeling safe, feeling that whatever we're doing with their tapping is an amount that they can handle and integrate and work with. And so often for me, what I don't like hearing personally is kind of the phrase of, all right, what's the first and worst time this ever happened to you in a first session? Like, let's just go there. Let's dig it out by the at the root, and let's just go there first, rather than first establishing safety, rapport, connection, because the client needs to first establish a conscious and subconscious level of feeling of safety with you as the practitioner, as well as with EFT, do very brand new things for many people. So the first concept that I want to talk about is pacing and slowness and a timing that keeps a person resourced and grounded and in a place that they can handle the change that we're doing. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, well, and I want to really highlight that particular thing right there. I think one of the healthy things that has happened in the tapping community is you hear significantly less people talking about the 1-minute miracles and the 1-session miracles and this thing, because at the beginning of my tapping career, I was that person who was running everybody over with my enthusiasm, where I talked people out of it because of that particular enthusiasm. And so, like, slowing it down, and like I can remember years ago I was working with a client who, to be honest, the only reason she was talking to me was to shut her husband up. Like, I was friends with the couple, and the husband was like, you need to tap with Gene, you need to tap with Gene, you need to tap with Gene. And so just to shut her husband up, she got on the phone with me. And 15 minutes in, she was now frustrated because a lifelong trauma had not gone away in a single round of tapping. Like, went from being completely displeased with the conversation to being frustrated with the rate that we were going as we were doing that particular thing. And happiness is outcome divided by expectation. And when we have these moments of great insight, we transform what our expectation is. And I would always rather err on doing transformation at a rate that is too slow than it is too fast. And I just want to, like, gold star this. We need to go slow. We need to go slow. We need to go slow, because this is not about how I feel 15 minutes from now. This is about the transformation that's happening in my life. And I'm willing to trade us doing this in 6 sessions versus 15 minutes if I'm going to have decades of success from this thing, and I'm going to do it in a way that is more safely. So I'm glad that you're saying that. And I want to just, like, throw 87 gold stars around that idea, because I think it's something that we really need to hear, because we can get over our skis and our excitement, and we need to go in a way that is healthy long-term, not cotton candy high evaporating.
Yeah, so I'm going to just, highlight your highlighting and kind of add some thoughts to that. Because it comes to the heart of being trauma informed, because I know that when practitioners either lead things too quickly or they allow things to go too quickly, right? Part of it is out of really wanting healing for the client, right? I mean, the biggest part. So it's not out of any malintent whatsoever. It's just a lack of trauma-informed knowledge and skill that allows the pace. It's almost like rolling downhill, and oh my God, it's rolling downhill, and now I need to use the client's words, and all of a sudden they're getting sucked into that trauma pool, and now we're going, right? So that can happen in a session where reactions and re-traumatization can happen. So we need to, I think it's important for practitioners to develop the strength of will and understanding of the willingness to not break rapport, but the importance of pre-framing, the importance of educating why we're going slow. So I'm thinking of a client that came to me, had some experience with EFT, wanting to work on their intimacy issues in their life, and knew there was an early sexual trauma. Okay, I did enough exploration at comfortable. It was a single time event, things that I then felt comfortable and skillful going with this person. And they wanted to dive in the first session. And I had to explain from a trauma-informed languaging that meant for them why that wasn't a good idea, why actually I wasn't willing to do that. They were not happy with that at first. And I just had to keep educating. It's like, look, tell you what, today we're going to work on how this is showing up in your life now. And we ended up working on, like, a recent date or a recent phone call that didn't happen after a date. And there was such emotionality in the session that every part of me was like, as hard as it was to put the brakes on for that client and explain and recover and reestablish rapport and safety and connection, even though they wanted something different, that I was so happy that we had established that before we ended up working on the traumatic incident. That takes a muscle of experience over time to be willing to do that. And I think it's Gwyneth Moss that said, and I use this all the time, is the way that I see my role is as a seeing eye dog or a vision impaired animal. So the person, I check in a person, it's like, what do you want to do together? And they say, I want to go to the supermarket. And I say, great, I can help you do that. And we're going along to the supermarket and they start walking across in the middle of a 4-lane street. And I'm like, wait a minute. We're not doing that. We're going to the corner. We're going to wait till the light turns green. Then we're going to cross. I'm happy to get you there. So my job is to facilitate whatever they want to do in a safe way and not say, oh, let's go to the dog park, by the way. I'd really like to go there. Wouldn't that be a great place to go? So it's always client-led. And we want to always use our clients' words, but not all of their words, and not always follow where they're going. We have to kind of learn that trauma-informed when. Let's slow it down. Let's establish it. See how you do with this first. But we have to do some education about that first. And I'm not saying I trauma-inform educate every person I work with, because I don't also want, if they weren't experiencing or that's not their perception, I want to dance with that as well. It's like giving a diagnosis. It's like, oh, you've been through I once was working with a Reiki practitioner who was working on me. She's like, oh my God, you must have so much PTSD from that. And I remember I just like froze in that moment, like, what? So we have to be careful with that, but pre-framing and educating them in a way that understands what trauma does to the body, why they're maybe not able to change, even they know that they want to, but they can't. And so that level of understanding that we can dole out pieces and pre-framing and explaining things is like, oh, that makes sense. That helps me to be able to work at the pace that we were talking about and understand why we're going slowly and we're not just diving in. Because other practitioners I worked in, they just dove right in, you know. So yeah, a lot of that.
And I think this was like the other fork I was thinking about a little earlier, is that like I could see a misunderstanding of a trauma-informed approach going, ooh, there's trauma, let's go find the trauma, which is different than, ooh, a trauma-informed approach is, this is a person who has experienced trauma, therefore it impacts the way that I approach and the speed that I go. So it's not that we're going after the trauma, but I recognize you are a person who has experienced trauma, therefore I'm responding to you in a way that is useful because that is the case. Because I could see the mistake going, like, because I mean, like, one of the very early like pitfalls we fell into with tapping was, you know, we were taught be as specific as possible, which people read as tapping is only successful if I am specific. And that's not it. It's as specific as possible. And sometimes as specific as possible is this sucks. And that is the only specificity I have. And if we go diving in and we go rushing ahead too quickly, it's possible we break rapport, or even worse, we create unsafety. And so I like going, okay, trauma-informed means I understand who you are as a human. It doesn't necessarily mean that's the reason we're doing this particular work.
Yeah, that's such one of my next points. I mean, I love this because you're forecasting everything I wanted to say.
We'll continue. Let's hear it.
Well, I think, and my experience and my observation is in the EFT world, is because I think it's impossible to be doing any EFT without being trauma-informed to some level. In other words, I don't think that there is an EFT practitioner that doesn't have a level of awareness of the importance and significance of trauma on a person and the choices they make, the beliefs they have, et cetera. So I always think that there's some. And there should be some in every training as well. But that's just kind of a beginning place. But what I wanted to say is what that then makes practitioners often realize is the power and the significance of trauma in a person's life, which being less trauma-informed means let's find out your traumas.
Right.
Let's work on your trauma. But I just wanted to work on my procrastination. Yeah, but you said that that your dad beat you up when you were a kid. We should work on that because that probably has to do with the belief that you can't do. Right. So in other words, just because somebody has revealed that there's trauma doesn't mean you work on it.
And that's the reason why I stopped using the traditional setup phrase a long time ago, not even realizing that's what I was doing, was this idea of, you know, we're dealing with a pain in my knee and they're like, and I love and accept myself. I'm like, no, I don't. Well, now I've just added this extra issue that had nothing to do with what we were talking about right now. And so for me, I found that it's only useful to tap on self-esteem issues when it's useful for us to tap on self-esteem issues. So I'm not going to introduce self-love sooner than it is appropriate for me to do that, because I don't want to be in a circumstance where all of a sudden, like, well, no, I don't love myself, and like re-traumatizing them in that particular way.
And now you brought up you brought up an issue that they didn't come to you for.
That's right. Yeah.
They didn't come to you to work on self-esteem. They came to you for their back pain or whatever, right? So I love that element. And I do think that self-esteem is critical, but I think this is a client-centered approach. We need to be guided by what they want out of our work together. And, even the most skillful trauma-informed teachers in the world will tell you sometimes working on a past trauma destabilizes their life. They're not in a stable enough place to be able to integrate, and we don't have the skill or the scope, and that's kind of another question. So just because you hear a belief, just because you hear a trauma, doesn't mean you're like, let's work on that.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one really important piece, because working on a trauma is not necessarily what's necessary for the person. It may not be the right time for the person, and it also may not be what the person wants to work on, and you've led them there. So elements with that. So that's a piece there. We also have to recognize the importance of what's called the trauma pull, P-U-L-L, and the trauma pull kind of is a concept that describes, once I start kind of locking in, like I kind of have a mental lock on the trauma, it's present. When a trauma is not fully processed, there's an inward, often pulling to deal with and resolve and overcome that trauma. So it's a natural force, but it often pulls faster and harder and quicker. And so you may recognize sometimes when somebody starts talking about a trauma that's been unprocessed, they start talking faster and faster, and they often kind of numb out. Like you're hearing details and you're like inside going, what the heck? And they're just like, especially veterans and war trauma and violence related trauma, they disconnect, perhaps dissociate, and they just start going down that path. And we have to be willing to pause that. If that happens in a first session, for me, I never work on a significant big T trauma in a first session ever. It is a rule for me. So what do we do with that? Once sometimes people have worked on it in therapy and they said, yeah, well, my dad or mom used to do this, etc. And we can put that aside gently. It's not hard for them. But if all of a sudden they're landing there and emotionally they're starting to get caught in that trauma pull, we're going to need to do some sort of containment, container, box method, et cetera, to be able to safely put something aside and say, look, it's not best if we go there today. We'll get to it. It's so important that you share that with me. That's really beautiful. I'm touched. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to do this thing to be able to put it aside so we can come back to that at a timing that's you're going to best be able to integrate that and work with that and do it in a gentle way, because everything I do is about safety and about being gentle. In order to process trauma, we want to be gentle and careful. So sometimes just because a trauma shows up in a session doesn't mean, we got to go there. So that's another caveat.
And I think another thing about that is because tapping is such a versatile tool, Gary's old phrase, try it on anything. And one of the things that I found really, as I've been working with folks and training folks, one of the phrases that I use a lot is, if you're not qualified to deal with the issue without tapping, tapping does not qualify you to work with the issue.
Oh,
just because I can tap on, just because you can tap on the issue doesn't mean we should tap on the issue right now. And it doesn't mean I am a qualified person to be tapping with you right now as we step into it.
Gene, I literally could have sent you my bullet points, and you are like the next one ahead on almost every one. So
Great.
Stay in your lane. Now, What does that mean? Because it's not black and white either. Right. So what are different elements of what I mean by that? So we're speaking to an audience here of the public, of EFT practitioners, of licensed practitioners, licensed mental health care practitioners, and there are different lanes with each of those. And ultimately, what is the lane about? It's about safety and protection for the client, well-being, and you as a practitioner.
Yep.
So, there are different elements. It's very different working with a singular trauma than somebody that has complex PTSD that was sexually abused their whole childhood. Two very different scenarios. Things to take into consideration is the person currently working with somebody that's licensed? Are you working collaboratively on certain elements of that? So for example, I'm thinking of, I've trained a lot of licensed psychologists and other people, And one of them was working with a woman with PTSD, kind of hit their limit, and out of honor and respect, referred the person to me. Can you help a little bit more? And I had a consult with the person and diagnosed PTSD, going through pandemic stuff and getting triggered all the time. And I wanted to make sure that this person was in a lane that I felt comfortable with. And it was like, so how's that showing up as a problem? What's going on in your life now that you're having challenges with? And almost every response was like, my PTSD is getting triggered by this. And like everything kept leading back to that. And just my meter was like, this is a no for me.
Yeah.
Because it was all about the diagnosis and all about that and all about their condition. And I'm not a licensed mental health care practitioner. Now, that being said, we have to use that internal guidance meter to keep our practice open and safe and to keep our clients safe, all of that. So there, you have to use that guidance meter, that's kind of that gut check. But I also want to think, for example, that there are many times I said, I'm comfortable working with you on this particular forward-facing issue about this change or behavioral change or what you're wanting to achieve, because that, as a coach, is an important part for me of goal setting to the future. I don't just work on somebody's past. Looks like therapy, sounds like therapy, tastes like therapy, you know. But just because somebody's a licensed therapist doesn't mean that they're fully trauma-informed either. And I say that out of complete love and respect for my licensed colleagues, because they're the first ones that informed me of that. It's like, you think we have trauma training? I mean, until more recently, that just because somebody's licensed doesn't mean that they're any more qualified or skilled at working with trauma than we are. But they also know the resources. I'm not the person that somebody's calling at night when the Marines are coming in through the walls, right? I'm not the person when they're having a schizophrenic break. I'm not the person that's taking, that's in their bed all day, not able to work. So knowing my scope, knowing my lanes, knowing when to collaborate, knowing when to communicate with the licensed practitioner or working as a team, that I'm not their therapist. These are, lots of shades of gray, because we have to be careful of working with trauma and unprocessed trauma as EFT practitioner. So I forget exactly your words, but I love them because they really spoke to the point.
And the other thing I think it's also important in recognizing that safety piece is there is, at the beginning, like you said, this gut, boy, this just isn't the right lane for me. There's also the inflow where I think we're starting in one direction and we end up somewhere else. But also it's important for us working with people to be comfortable enough, not only at the beginning, but in the middle. And the thing that I have learned is, it is amazing the amount of thinking you can do during the length of a deep breath. And so as I'm working with a client, we start to wander into a place where I'm starting to ask the question, boy, is this the right thing for me? For me, the instinct is great. What I need you to do is tap on your collarbone, take a nice big deep breath for me, which makes sense. It's perfectly in flow. It's what we normally do when we're having the conversation. I do, like, it's the first thing I ever have a client do when we start tapping. Great, tap the side of your hand, take a deep breath, tap on your collarbone, just to establish this thing. But the amount of thinking that I can do in the length of that deep breath to go, okay, am I keeping them and me safe in this particular moment? And if the answer to that question is no, if we go down this path, great, tap on the side of your hand, take a nice big deep breath, open your eyes. Awesome. Let's have a conversation about this. But giving ourselves permission as well, like when we start to get into the weeds, it doesn't mean that we need to stay there, that we also need to come out, because sometimes we don't have enough information at the beginning, or we just missed a beat at the beginning and all of a sudden recognize, boy, I'm out of my lane and I need to get back in my lane in order for us to be safe.
I think those pauses are so powerful. And to be honest, if I was a client and somebody said, you know what, I just want to give that a moment to just sit with that and see where we want to go with that. Thank you so much. Okay. That's not showing me, even though inside I'm going, what the hell do I do now with that?
Yes, absolutely.
A few second pause is completely natural. And I think often, the tappable, let's not reflect back, the importance of self-tapping on the concerns of what happens if this happens. What happens if somebody shares that? What do I do? And so, I mean, self-tapping with regard to working around the issue of trauma with your clients is critical. And I don't want to forget two really key elements, because I know time is flying. One of them is the importance of understanding that the body is boss. As Bessel's book says, the body keeps the score. That sometimes we can use a lot of the, the formal gentle techniques to work by distancing somebody from an event and just working with how that's showing up in my body now, for example.
Yeah.
And there's a tether to something much bigger, but all the sneaking up techniques, all the tearless trauma, but especially like chasing the pain, and we can use our body because things come, trauma enters through our body and it exits through our body. So many of the somatic experiencing, so many other movement techniques include the use of the body to dispel and release trauma. David Berceli's work, trauma release technique, etc., that remember the importance of including the body and that it's not all cognitive. And the other part I just want to get, and I'll hand it back to you, is the importance of resourcing.
Yep.
So what do I mean by that? I think it's something that I would like to see be a much more integral part of the EFT world. And what I mean by that is often clients, especially ones that have lived through a lot of trauma, either don't recognize or practice or have so available to them in their consciousness what resources them and makes them feel good or calm or grounded. So when I'm doing a discovery session, my first session with somebody where I'm starting to get to know about their history and know them, a very important part is always, what do you do, or what when you tune in or think about gives you that soft belly? So in other words, that way, whenever we get in the weeds, as you say, I can help remind them about that resource. I can help remind them between sessions to be able to practice those resources. When working with traumatic things, being able to not just work on the trauma, but be able to cultivate things that make them feel grounded, good, and safe are really important. So I have them journal what those are, start to list them, use them in a session. That resourcing to help keep a client regulated is so important. A regulated client doesn't mean they're not feeling emotion. It just doesn't mean they're bawling it on the floor and not able to talk or having an ab reaction. So, trauma informed is being safe, keeping that client in an optimal amount of arousal, helping them with their resources, another critical piece I wanted to make sure and add.
And if folks are looking for some really great resources on that, Rick Hanson, Hanson's book Resilient talks a lot about how do we figure out what those resource states are, but also how do we turn them up and how do we access them in places that we're feeling stuck. So it's not just about clearing this thing that is a struggle, but giving us access to these higher resource states that allow us to navigate the world in that particular way. And that's just another useful thing for us to know and appreciate as we're stepping into all of this.
Another great one is Deb Dana, who works with Stephen Porges of Polyvagal Theory, Polyvagal Institute. And when they talk about when we move from that more dissociated, frozen state, that we can't just jump into that happy state, right? It's too big a leap. So we move in a way that's feeling disconnected and frozen from that response into a more mobilized move. So in other words, for somebody that's very much in that dissociated, frozen kind of state, that dorsal vagal state, we want to mobilize, we want to get movement, we want to have energy moving to get into that more sympathetic kind of state. And then from there, we can start to do things that move us into that more calm, regulated home safe zone, so to speak. So
yeah, and as people think about that, another way I like to think about that is like an emotional scale, like going from depression to anger. Well, anger sucks, but anger is more active than depression lying on the couch. Going from anger to frustration, frustration is no fun, but I'm much more likely to make choices I'm happy with and I'm frustrated than when I'm angry. And so the action isn't to feel great. The action is, what's the next best thing I can feel in this moment, which allows me to take a step forward? What's the next best thing I can feel in this moment? And sometimes we don't get to euphoria. Sometimes the place I get to, the next best I can get to is just a little bit grounded in this moment. I'm no longer punching holes in the wall. And that's not a perfect state, but boy, is it a better state. And that's the place that I can get to. Because like you'd mentioned earlier, like the sense of scope, like there is a limit based on the time that we have on our own or time with a client. But there's also like the limit to what we have physically and how far, like we can move intellectually and emotionally very, very far. The physical body still moves through physical time and we can move faster than we think. But like just because running 10 miles is good, running 100 miles is not 10 times better. Like there's capacity to what we can do when we're approaching this sort of stuff.
And I love that pacing. It's why I don't do single session new clients ever, never, because the pressure and the expectation to hit a home run and do transformation in a session is not healthy and it isn't safe. And so there is a minimum commitment that I have with a client so that I can feel like we can go at a pace that is okay and that is safe. And, and I also want to be that brings up one other thing, the distinction between self-regulation, self-tapping, and working with a practitioner. Very different. Both of them have huge benefits. But personally, even though I know it's possible, I never have a client tapping on their own huge traumas because there's not a person to co-regulate with them when they're all of a sudden, they fell off the life, they're out in the open sea and it's turbulent and there's waves and they fell off the life raft. There's nobody holding that life raft still and steady for them to climb back onto. And they're splashing around and it gets worse the more you splash. So I think that we need to, when we work with our clients, and each one is an individual case, is what we co-create with them as far as homework, their skill level, what things that they bring back to the session to work with me, what things it's okay for them to work on. That's an important consideration. I'm not going to say there's a right or wrong, but I'm going to say it's a really important consideration for what somebody, we don't know, for example, how much work has the person done on themselves? What kind of attachment style do they have in their childhood? How do they, there's so many different pieces that go into this art of EFT, right? The beauty of EFT is how deeply it goes quickly. It's amazing. The danger of EFT is how deeply it goes quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's one of the reasons why, our friend Gwen Moss, like when she's teaching folks to tap for the very first time on their own, she teaches them to tap without words. Like their homework is just to feel into their body and just to tap on their body and see what they feel because it's safer. And like, as you're saying all of this, I consider myself a very skilled practitioner. I've worked very, very hard to be a skilled practitioner. And every 2 weeks I work with a practitioner myself because I recognize the fact, one, I'm too close. And two, like I can't always hold the ballast for all that is going on my own, even as skilled, because I'm so close to my own experience that even with surgeons don't do surgery on themselves because they recognize that's not a good thing. For those of us with these skills, it's important for us to recognize that as well.
And the personal work is critical as a practitioner. If you're finding, getting triggered in a session by your client is a really good wake-up call of there's something there for me to look at. Not saying it doesn't happen and we need to hold that safe space in a session, but our personal work is the most important thing that we can do to be a safe trauma-informed practitioner and hold that space for a client to be able to go through whatever they need to go through in a session without us all of a sudden getting dragged overboard. So
and it's something that's really, to pay close attention to in another arena that I worked in with young people in the 90s and the aughts. One of the things we talked a lot about with the adults was this idea of the wounded healer, the person who was showing up to be the helper because they were unwilling to look at their own stuff. Because if I'm helping everybody else, I don't have to look at my own stuff. And recognizing like this trauma-informed approach isn't just about creating the safety for our clients in the space that we create, but it's how we show up. And if we're not doing our own work, then we are not putting ourselves in a space that we can create safety for someone else. It's great that I can be helpful to everybody else because I don't have to look at my own crap, but that's not actually helpful in the long run. And it's not a safe way for us to be helpers in the world.
And recognizing that which we're not recognizing, when a client that shows up that doesn't show up on time and we're getting pissed off and what is it that's causing me to get a little overreactive and a little over emotional to that situation? So we're as guilty, or vulnerable to that as anybody, as any client, of not seeing through the trees of, and I think that's a great way to, as we start to wind down here, of trauma-informed approach. Anytime that I don't want to say overreacting, highly reactive in a situation or defensive in a situation, how do I start to bring in that lens of, okay, as dear friend Monica Owens says, the thing ain't never the thing. Right. So what's showing up right now that's bothering you is the person that didn't show up. What it's triggering in me is feelings of abandonment or disrespect that goes back to times that I was younger and not respected, etc. So this is the current rendition of what's showing up, and the bigger part of the iceberg is back there for us to do work on.
And I think the useful way for us to look at that, Will Horton, who I studied NLP with, whenever a client would say something, his response was fascinating. And fascinating is this word of curiosity. And so when there's something going on in our own life, when we start noticing these things where we've been out of shape, not necessarily trying to figure it out, to go, That's a fascinating response. I wonder what's behind it, which then again is this idea of this gentle, slow approach of not going, oh, I can't believe I'm getting, like, I'm angry and I'm angry that I'm getting angry and I'm angry that I'm getting angry that I'm getting angry. Instead of going, that's fascinating. Client didn't show up on time and boy, am I having a disproportionate emotional response. That's something for me to consider, which again gives us like this gentle, safe, slow approach to create safety for ourselves and those that we're showing up for.
So I totally agree with you. And you know, when we look at Dan Siegel and what happens when we get triggered, right, and we flip our lid, I can't easily access curiosity there. So the practice of being polyvagally informed, the practice of moving quickly back into a ventral vagal state of an integrated is from here I can get creative and interested and curious. From here, I'm pissed off, irritated, defensive, and angry, etc. So first is that continual practice of this happens. I recognize this. I start to tap and do whatever I do. Practices to be able to get here. From here, I wonder why that really got me so annoyed, etc. So yes, curiosity, I love it, but it's sometimes hard in the moment to access the witnessing curiosity. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, this could go on for a very long time.
Absolutely. But this is a really useful conversation because I think it does a really good job of giving us a chance to like frame and think about the way that we approach things. And if we walk away with nothing other than, okay, how do I show up in a way that makes it safest for me? And how do I show up in a way that makes it safest for the people around me? Like, we're just going to be better as we show up in the world, tappers or not. And so I think it's, like you said, it's hard for us to like pin down what the actual definition is, but by having it as one more question, open tab in our process as we're trying to figure out all of this, we're more likely to show up in a healthy, useful way.
I agree. The way I think of it, and we actually talk about a lot in Tapping Out of Trauma in the class, is for me, am I a safe practitioner?
Yeah.
I don't think that there is an end to that. I think that the idea of how can I be a safe practitioner is a never-ending exploration. Yeah. Just like being trauma-informed is a never-ending exploration. So,
the question actually becomes, how do I become a safer practitioner? How do I become a safer practitioner? And by keep asking it that way, we just keep leaning into it more and more.
Yep, I agree. Thank you so much for having this conversation today. I love it.
I really appreciate it, Craig. Thanks for your time.
You're welcome.